Hi, everybody. This is Jennifer Schaus, and we're coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us in our webinar series in 2024 as we cover the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations. Our webinar series are complimentary, and they're held typically on Wednesdays and Fridays unless there is a federal holiday. They are all recorded, and you can find the webinars on our YouTube channel along with 600 other government contracting webinars. If you're looking just for the PowerPoint, you can hop over to slideshare.net and log in there with your LinkedIn credentials. It doesn't cost you anything, and you can find any of our, again, 600 plus PowerPoint presentations there as well. If you're interested in sponsoring or advertising, we do have opportunities available in this series, as well as putting on your own webinar. We did cover the FAR back in 2020, so it's been 4 years. If you're anxious to look at a part that we have yet to cover, just keep in mind that if you do go to that section of our website, again, it's just called the FAR, that you're going to have some dated information. And this slide here kind of gives you a picture of that. If you're looking to register for any of our upcoming webinars, you can find those on our website under the section called the FAR. You can also find the recordings there. A little bit about us. We do provide consulting services for established government contractors worldwide, and we primarily help them with GSA schedules. Other services are listed on our website, and some of them are highlighted here on the screen. You can simply hop over to our website and click on the About Us to learn more. We also have digital marketing services for companies that are selling to federal contractors, so banks, law firms, payroll companies, these type of organizations. We offer advertising in our newsletter, which now reaches almost 30,000 subscribers, most of which are government contractors. You can either advertise in our webinars, put on your own webinar, and then for our events, we do offer sponsorship. If you're interested in learning more about any of those advertising services to reach federal contractors, not the government, send us an email and ask for our media kit. We did have a webinar last week on GSA schedules with our friends over at the Western Michigan Apex Accelerator. That is listed on our website, and you can access the recording on our YouTube channel. If anyone's looking for help with DHS PACs, NASA SOUP, we can certainly help you. And then we've got some upcoming sponsored content webinars in June. We've got a 2-part series with Carrie Palmatier from Palmatier Law. She's covering SBIRs and STTRs, again, in a 2-part series. These are complimentary. The registration links are on our website under the section called Events. Even though these are webinars, these are remotely conducted webinars, and they won't cost you anything, just your time to attend. Okay, now we want to thank our webinar sponsors. This is what allows our webinars to be provided complimentary to you. And so we want to thank our friends at GovEvents. That's the premier platform for posting events related to government and government contracting. You can find all of our webinars and our events on govevents.com, as well as recordings from our past 600 plus webinars. We also want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert. That's the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for small, women-owned, veteran-owned, hub zone, and 8A firms. Visit setasidealert.com for more information. The Fairfax County Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars, and we want to thank them for posting our events and webinars on their calendar. The Virginia Apex Accelerator at George Mason University offers free one-on-one counseling to established government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore their services, review homework recommendations, register for live training, and find useful links to agencies and other self-directed learning. One-on-one counseling is limited to eligible client companies. Appointment requests are handled in the order they were received and based on counselor availability due to high demand. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. And again, we encourage you to contact the Virginia Apex Accelerator. They've recently been rebranded. You may know them as the Virginia PTAC. The Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce holds a monthly government contracting council meeting allowing you to network with contracting peers, learn about upcoming events, opportunities to also contribute to future programming. The meetings take place the fourth Tuesday of each month at 8:30 a.m. at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. The next meeting will be on Tuesday, April 23rd. If you've got questions, please contact Alicia Field. The NOVA, also from the Reston Chamber, their Business to Government Matchmaking Conference is coming up May 2nd. We will be there. It's from 8 to 1 o'clock at the same place as last year, which is the Sheraton Reston Hotel. More information is on their website at thenova.restonchamber.org. We hope to see you there. BidSpeed, do you want help winning government contracts? BidSpeed can help. Users can find bidding opportunities from federal, state, and local government. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contact, expiring contracts, compliance matrices, and also proposal templates. Create your login today at bidspeed.com. BidSpeed is an official partner of the US SBA 7J Management and Technical Assistance Program. FBC. Events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel report that they attend more than one event each year. FBC has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity symposiums, tech expos, and offsite meetings. FBC provides full lifecycle meeting planning and event management with over 5,000 meetings under their belt. FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at fbcinc.com. Last but not least, GovBrew. Please check out our friends over at GovBrew. GovBrew is the most read government contracting newsletter, keeping thousands of government contracting professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal contracting market, all in a fun and accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read. It's 100% free to join. It goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m. Eastern. It's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. We encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on your screen. Okay, the reason that we are here today is to cover the FAR, specifically FAR Part 19. We are joined by Zach Prince. He's going to cover again FAR Part 19, small business programs. He's got some great slides here for you. And Zach, really appreciate the time that you took to put together the content and to deliver it live today with us. So I'm going to put myself on mute and just let me know when you're ready for your next slide.
I appreciate that, Jennifer, and glad to be here. Good day, everyone. My name is Zach Prince. I'm a partner in the government contracts practice at Haynes Boone. My practice covers everything to do with government contracts, from transactional and compliance matters to litigation and appeals, covering pretty much every part of the FAR and DFARS and other agency supplements. Today, we're going to be talking about FAR Part 19. It's going to be a whirlwind tour of this section because pretty much every part of this webinar could be its own webinar, but I'm going to do my best to keep things concise, give you a good overview, and then glad to take questions by email. And if you want to learn more about any of these subtopics, please let me know. Maybe it'll be a topic for another presentation. Next slide. I think we maybe accidentally jumped to the last one. We're close to the last one. Well, somehow it got misordered, but that's okay. This is just an overview of all the topics we're going to cover today. FAR Part 19 is a pretty comprehensive part of the FAR. It covers everything to do with small businesses. We're going to talk about the overview of the small business programs, and the different types of programs: service disabled, veteran owned, hub zone, standard small business, etc. We're going to get into set-asides and sole sources and talk about the triggering criteria for those. We'll touch on small business subcontracting plans, which are required if you are a other than small business, otherwise known as a large business. We'll do some brief discussion of the SBA All Small, the Mentor Protege program, and then we will finish off with a brief discussion of size and status protests. Again, every one of these could be its own presentation, so please forgive me that I am necessarily going to be doing some summarizing and glossing over things that really need to get fleshed out before you can truly understand the intricacies. Next slide. So just starting off, the purpose of FAR Part 19 and the small business programs in general is to provide maximum practicable opportunities in government procurement for small businesses, which includes all the subtypes of small businesses, veteran-owned small businesses, service-disabled veteran-owned, historically underutilized business-owned, and women-owned small businesses, and small disadvantaged businesses. There are a lot of acronyms, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with in government contracting already. There are even more in small businesses. The goal here is to provide opportunities for small businesses to subcontract through small business subcontracting plans and to get opportunities directly from the federal government and prime contracts, and overall ensure that a fair portion of contracts are going to small businesses. To do that, next slide, please. The government sets goals that are communicated to agencies annually on the percentages of awards, both at prime and subcontract, that should be going to small businesses, subdivided into the various categories of small businesses. So for 2022, which is the most recent reported set of data, the government set a goal of 23% overall subcontracting, of prime contracting. That was achieved with flying colors, exceeding the planned percentages overall for small businesses. There was some less than desirable breakdown. There's fewer contracts were going to women-owned small businesses than was desired in these percentages. A little bit more to small disadvantaged small businesses, a little bit more to service disabled, and as is unfortunately almost always the case, less than the goal for hub zone small businesses. This is even more so at the subcontract level, where hub zone small businesses really did not get the percentage that was hoped. And we'll talk about a little bit why later on. It's a very complicated program and it's hard to maintain eligibility. Overall, there is a trend of hitting the goals and exceeding the goals, particularly for certain agencies. But when you break that down into the subcategories, the objectives are not always reached. Next slide. So we'll talk about what it means to qualify as small, but it's important to start off by noting that there are major penalties for misrepresenting your size status. One, suspension or debarment, right? If your business is to be a government contractor and you are suspended from receiving government contracts for a defined period, or debarred entirely for a 3-year period from government contracting, that is potentially the death knell for your business. That can be imposed, suspension or debarment can be imposed even if you are exculpated with an investigation. That is, the government investigates under a False Claims Act theory and the case is dismissed, or the government doesn't pursue action. The contracting officer, the agency suspension or debarment official, can nonetheless start a suspension or debarment proceeding. And just initiating the proceeding can be problematic for your ability to be deemed responsible and continue to get government contract awards. So it's a significant penalty. Then there are civil penalties under the False Claims Act, potentially, depending on the nature of the misrepresentation. I just got out from under one of those investigations for a client. The government takes these things quite seriously, particularly where there is evidence of intentional misconduct. You are defrauding the government by misrepresenting the size status of a business in order to receive the benefits of contract dollars that are intentionally set there for small businesses. This has interest of the Department of Justice. It's easy to help a jury understand why this is problematic. It can be pretty severe if you get to a False Claims Act case. There are, in really egregious cases, criminal penalties. And it doesn't happen very often, but it happens where a business is, for example, setting up sham entities and obfuscating who's really in control of them in order to avoid affiliation and continue to receive set-aside orders and or other advantages as a small business, or setting up a somebody as a figurehead to be the ostensible person in control of a business who really has no control or authority and is just being used to grant their SDVO status, service disabled or woman owned or whatever it might be. Next slide. So now that I've added, given the color of the penalties for failing to do this right, so what is a small business? We're going to talk about each of these issues. A small business, generally speaking, you are small for a particular procurement under a particular North American industrial industry classification standard or NAICS code. That is, you might be small for opportunity X, but not for opportunity Y. It's usually incorrect to say that you are just blanket a small business. For exemption from the cost accounting standards, which is outside of the scope of this, but one of the exemptions is small business. There, it's a question of whether you are small under your primary NAICS code. I can talk very briefly about that in a moment. We'll talk about affiliation. Affiliation is really important and gets lost often for some small businesses. If you have several companies that are under common control or ownership, and there are a few ways that the Small Business Administration assesses affiliation, you may be affiliates of one another, and even though business A is small on its own and business B is small on its own, when you aggregate their employees or you aggregate their revenues, they no longer qualify as small. The affiliation principle is a big deal. Often happens in acquisitions over the last few years. There's been a flurry of acquisitions of government contractors where a large entity will purchase a small one that does a substantial volume of government business, and the large one does not have the level of familiarity with government contracting that would have told them that, oh, now we need this business to stop stating it qualifies as small. Right? That can lead to significant penalties and ramifications for businesses. We'll talk about socioeconomic status. So you're not just small, but you are a veteran-owned small business or a woman-owned small business. Those statuses have different meanings and different imports for how a procurement may be classified. And we'll talk about limitations on subcontracting. That is, you can't just receive a award that was predicated on your size status and then subcontract most of the work to a large business. There are specific rules on how much you're allowed to subcontract, exceptions for subcontracting to similarly situated entities. And these rules can be a bit complicated. They've gotten easier in the past decade or so since Congress changed the formula, and eventually that became implemented in the FAR, but it took a really long time. And we'll get into some of this nuance. Next slide. So I mentioned NAICS codes. It's NAICS like snakes. I hear this mispronounced a lot, so I thought it would be helpful to say this aloud. These are defining, will be defining the size standard that applies to a particular procurement. So Some of them are employee-based, which is a measure of the average number of people that are employed by the concern in the preceding 24 months. Some of these size standards are revenue-based, is an averaging of your annual receipts over the 5 prior fiscal years. There are nuances and exceptions, and I urge you to take a look at 13 Code Federal Regulation sections 121 to give you a bit more color and the detail here, because it is important to know what the details are when you're doing these calculations to ensure that you do actually qualify. But you will see that a procurement will be classified under a particular NAICS code, and if it is classified under one NAICS code, you might find you do qualify as small, and another you might find you do not. There is a reason that you will have size protests at times that are about whether the NAICS code is appropriate, and that is because it can matter quite a bit to who qualifies as small under the procurement. Next slide. So I mentioned affiliation. The important overall concept for affiliation to keep in mind is that it is a holistic analysis. The Small Business Administration gives itself substantial discretion in determining affiliation. No individual element is necessarily determinative. Unfortunately, what that means is that there are instances where you might look at the regulations and think, oh, well, we don't really have affiliates, and then the SBA could come in and say, actually, we disagree for the following reasons based on our discretionary application of the standards. Generally, affiliation is the ability or power to control a concern. Either concern A can control concern B or vice versa, or a third party has the ability or power to control both or more than two entities. This control right can be affirmative or negative. I mean, you can have a ability to control even if not exercised. That creates affiliation, and that's an important point. It doesn't need to be exercised. It needs to be exercisable to create affiliation. So it requires some really careful scrutiny of corporate structures, interrelated managements, interrelated stock ownership, and things of that like. Next slide. And here I talk about a bit of the bases for affiliation and things that I've just alluded to. That stock ownership, entity A owns the stock or the majority of the stock of companies B and C. All those entities are almost certainly going to be affiliated. The same is true with stock options. That is, an entity has the ability, effectively, to the right to own and therefore control a series of corporations that can create affiliation. Common management, identity of interests, familial relationships can be enough to create affiliation. A husband and wife, parents, and children, other close family relations can be sufficient if there isn't enough separation to create a presumption of affiliation. For newly organized concerns, there's special rules to consider when an entity has just been stood up and is arguably unusually reliant on another business for the bulk of its work. That creates at least optics that entity was created just to act as a small business, to be a funnel of work to another larger business. Then there's the ostensible subcontractor principle, which is fairly similar to some of the underlying concerns, the newly organized concern rule. That is, if an entity is unusually reliant on a subcontractor, it can create affiliation. And again, emphasizing it's a totality of the circumstances analysis. So the SBA is not going to be confined to one thing or another. It can permit somewhat creative arguments, when you are challenging a determination of affiliation. Unfortunately, it also allows some pretty creative arguments from the SBA as to why there might be affiliation in certain contexts. This uncertainty and totality of the circumstances concept is somewhat helpful when you're defending against an allegation that the False Claims Act was violated because you ignored affiliation. That is, if affiliation is based on totality of the circumstances and no one circumstance is sufficient necessarily to establish it, then it's hard for the government to establish that a contractor had the requisite mindset that you need in order to violate the False Claims Act, because it's hard to say you have objectively had an affiliation. I'm not going to go too far down to the weeds in that, but it is something that's worth thinking about if you ever are unfortunate enough to get to that circumstance. Next slide. So there are some exceptions for affiliation. Mentor Protege is the one that is usually of most interest, and other qualifying small business joint ventures. We'll talk about the Mentor Protege program a bit later, but it is a way for small businesses to partner with large businesses and do government work, receive government work that they otherwise would not be able to. There are also exceptions for Indian tribes, ANCs, or Alaska Native corporations, Native Hawaii organizations, and community development corporations. There are also exceptions for affiliation for certain SBA approved investment entities. So it's helpful to know that. I occasionally come across those types of approved investment entities in acquisitions, and they can still take advantage after an acquisition of the small business benefits. Next slide. So there are limitations on subcontracting, like I mentioned before. If you've got an award that was set aside on the basis of size status or is issued as a sole source, then naturally there are concerns that you might use that award to actually funnel all the money that's supposed to be going to small businesses to a large business that would otherwise not have been able to compete. So the statute and the FAR and the SBA rules set out specific formulas for assessing compliance. FAR 52 to 219.14 is how it's implemented in contracts. There are exclusions, that is, the limitation does not apply to subcontracting to a similarly situated entity. I'll talk a bit about what that means. And then you've also got something called the non-manufacturer rule that applies when you're thinking about for a contract for products that the small business that received the contract doesn't make themselves, how to think about whether you've satisfied the limitations in subcontracting and are appropriately having received the subcontract or the prime contract. Next slide. So the limitations on subcontracting are different for supplies, services, and construction, but they used to be really different. It used to be a really complicated assessment based on the costs of the supplies, cost of services, and the overall cost of the contract. It is not easy, especially in a fixed price context, to be tracking costs at that level. And there are always some complications about trying to figure out what is included, what's excluded, et cetera. The government made it much easier by switching it to being a product of price, the total price the government paid for performance, and you can't spend more than X percent of that total price to subcontract. And here it matters quite a bit whether the procurement is classified as a supply contract versus a service contract versus construction, because you're thinking about what you're subcontracting based on subcontracting for the supplies versus subcontracting for the services. And if it's a service contract, it's not looking at the subcontracting amount for supplies that are necessary parts of performance. So again, these are complicated analyses. If you have questions, I would point you to 13 CFR 121. And of course, I'm happy to take emails if I'm able to answer questions after. But know that the rules are complicated. For construction, it's also different. Largely, that's because construction, by its nature, a prime contractor in a construction context is subcontracting to a lot of the trades, and they're acting as the general contractor who's managing the trades. But you are typically not doing everything yourself in a large construction project. You've got your electrical, you've got your civil, mechanical, etc. It's just the nature of construction versus other types of contracts. Next slide. So sometimes you've got recertification requirements. So I should mention first that as a general rule, the SBA provides that size status is measured at the time you submitted your proposal. So you may not be small at the time of award. Most procurements, most types of socioeconomic small business programs, that is the rule. Look in general at the SBA regs to understand where that might differ, but typically that's the rule. There are instances where recertification is still going to be required, even though you qualified at the time you submitted your bid as small. You have to recertify any contract that is past more than 5 years, so called long-term contract. You're going to require a recertification at the 5th year. Many companies hold Seaport Next Gen Macs right now. Those have that kind of rule. You'll see a lot of pretty much any Mac that goes for longer than 5 years. You'll see that applied because the SBA rules require it. There is a rule that was added a few years ago for instances of mergers, sale, acquisition, or novation. It is within 30 days of one of those events occurring, you have to let the government know if you are no longer small. And it has an impact on whether a contract, a set-aside award can be made. And if it, even though it would have otherwise been fine, if you just became a large business because of your natural growth or whatever it might be, it might not be fine in this instance. There is an 180-day rule, though, where if you've submitted a proposal, it's sat there for over 180 days before award, the agency may still be able to award the work to your business as a small business, even though you are no longer small as a result of a merger, sale, acquisition, or novation. The contracting officer can also require task order size recertifications. We see that occasionally. They'll say, yeah, you were all small for the underlying IDIQ or MAC, but for purposes of this task order, you must recertify that you currently are small. More often, that is for some of the socioeconomic programs that we'll talk about, and less for general small business status, but it depends on the procurement. And then an order that's set aside for a small business under an IDIQ or multiple award contract or MAC that itself was unrestricted typically requires certification separately. Next slide. So I mentioned socioeconomic programs, and I've talked about a few of these very briefly already, but we're going to get into the meat of them. There are a couple pretty notable programs. The 8A program, folks are generally aware of. Veteran-owned small business, which is really just a VA program, and service-disabled veteran-owned small business, or the SDVOSB program, which is government-wide and tends to be much more significant. The Hub Zone program, and then the Woman-Owned Small Business, or WOSB program. Next slide. So 8A, and 8A tends to get a lot of focus because of some sole source abilities that I'll mention in a moment. Generally, the requirements are to be part of the SBA's 8A program. You have to be a small business. You can't have previously participated in the program. You have to be 51% owned and controlled by socially and economically disadvantaged US citizens, which are defined terms. You have to have net worth of $850,000 or less, which is measured by your adjusted gross, in addition to an adjusted gross income of $400,000 or less, and total assets valued at 6.5 million or less. You have to have good character and have a potential for success, which typically means that you've had 2 years of experience as a viable business already, although that's waivable. So you can't just form a business usually and then immediately become part of the 8A program. This program is intended to boost existing viable businesses and not just act as a boost for a company that's just starting off. There have been some upsets in this program recently. There used to be a presumption of social disadvantage based on belonging to a particular race. That has been ruled as unconstitutional by the Eastern District of Tennessee District Court in the wake of a Supreme Court decision from last year. There are no longer these presumptive categories, so you have to submit a narrative to the SBA explaining how you are socially disadvantaged, and include some good explanation for why you believe that you qualify. Economic disadvantage is objective and is pretty easy to establish based on these initial and continuing requirements set forth in the regs. Assuming that you participate and that you continue to meet requirements, you can be in the 8A program for up to 9 years. Next slide. So the veteran-owned and service-disabled veteran-owned small business programs, SDVOSB, VOSB, require that you have to be a small business concern and be 51% directly and unconditionally owned by one or more veterans. And unconditionally, by the way, has some real meaning that's worth taking a look at. Or in the case of a SDVOSB is owned by a service-disabled veteran who manage and control the daily business operation. So you can't just be that a veteran owns it and doesn't really manage the day-to-day business. Again, this matters a lot because it's not a rent-a-vet program. It's not to go find a veteran, put them as the head of or the nominal ownership of a business that a large business is really controlling, or that somebody who is not qualifying into this category is really controlling. The point of this program, like with all of these programs, is to help groups of individuals and small businesses grow. It used to be that you could have self-certification. All of these programs have shifted so that none of them permit self-certification anymore. The certification process for SDVOSBs is still somewhat coming into real form. That is, they're still pending applications. So long as you had submitted your application by December 31 of 2023, you can usually still qualify for now, because the government, being the government, is slow with processing some of these applications. That I think will go away in the not too distant future, and you will at that point just have to be an SBA certified VOSB or SDVOSB to be eligible. You cannot simply self-certify any longer if you have not at least submitted your application by last year. Next slide. Yeah, the Hub Zone program is a challenging one. It was created in 1998 to encourage development in economically distressed communities, historically underutilized business zones. To qualify, you have to be a small business with your principal office located in the Hub Zone, and 35% of your employees have to reside in the Hub Zone, at least at the time of certification, and you have to make good faith efforts to keep that up. This is not easy to do because say you don't have very many employees and suddenly, one person leaves and is replaced by somebody who lives just outside a hub zone, or was in a hub zone, but the areas have been redesignated. It can suddenly make you ineligible for the program. The principal office definition is also pretty important and can get a little bit messed up. It was not exactly waived, but treated differently during COVID. But it is back in force now. Businesses I have seen really screw up with HubZone, usually unknowingly, but put themselves in positions where they could get investigated and get in real trouble for failing to comply with the requirements. You do get certified, so presumably the government's looking at it, but that is not entirely exculpatory if you've made no good faith efforts to comply. For that reason, it is the least used category. It is a little bit less confusing than it used to be. The rules have been tidied up a bit, but it's still quite complicated. Next slide. WOSB program. So to be certified as a WOSB, like with an SDVOSB, the business has to be small, has to be 51% directly and unconditionally. And again, directly, unconditionally, these are important. I mean, it excludes ownership through a trust, owned by and controlled by one or more women who are US citizens. Women have to manage the day-to-day operations, make long-term decisions for the business, and hold the highest officer position in the business and work full-time for the business during normal working hours. Again, all of these are set up to avoid people gaming the system to take advantage of the program. ED-WOSBs, economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses, which I don't see selected very often, but it can be, it has been, require all the same qualifications for a WOSB, plus it has a net worth requirement that is $850,000, excluding interest in the concern and equity in your primary residence. Next slide. One of the big advantages of being a small business is that you can compete for set-aside awards. There are certainly others, exemptions from various regulatory requirements, other advantages, and including price advantages. But one of the really important things is the rule of two. Agencies are required to set aside a competition for small businesses in acquisitions that are valued over a simplified acquisition threshold, currently $250,000. If the market research shows there is a reasonable expectation that they will receive fair market offers from at least 2 responsible small business concerns. This is an issue that has led to substantial bid protests, and there have been a lot of cases on this, because if an agency decides to hold fair, full and open competition, and you know that you and others would have bid on it as small businesses, you can challenge the agency's market research, and you would of course want it to be set aside, and vice versa. If you are a large business and you think that there are not at least 2 responsible small business concerns, you might want to challenge that as well. Socioeconomic categories require set-asides as well. So there's an 8A, if there's an 8A contract that the SBA had agreed to permit into the 8A program, it has to remain an 8A unless the SBA agrees, which is a huge, huge advantage if you are an 8A contractor. Same thing for WOSBs, that the government can choose to set aside specifically for a WOSB if they can make a showing internally that women are underrepresented in that industry. Generally, there's no other order of precedence among categories for set-asides. Next slide. That said, there are requirements for sole sources, which is of course even more advantageous. Even if there are fewer than 2 responsible sources, the agency can still award a sole source contract depending on the type of set aside of socioeconomic category, there are certain thresholds, maximum values, where even setting aside that there would be a responsible offerer in that category, the government still is not going to be doing it as a sole source. The rules vary depending on the category, and so it is worth being aware of your category and the category selected in any particular procurement. The SBA has the right to challenge an agency decision not to award HUBZone, SDVOSB, or women-owned small business sole sources. And 8A sole source decisions, the qualifications of the sole source awardee generally can't be challenged by the competitor, but the SBA can bring its own protest. Those rules can get very nuanced, so if it comes up, check closely to make sure you're following along. Next slide. So that's all at the prime contract level. So let's talk about at the subcontract level. So the way that the preference for small business is passed along and implemented through large prime contractors is through small business subcontracting requirements, FAR 52 219.8 and 219.9, which requires the plan itself. 219.8 provides that if you are receiving a contract that is over the simplified acquisition threshold, $250,000, you have to agree to provide the maximum practicable opportunities to small business. That is a pretty nebulous obligation, but it does have some teeth. And so you really do have to make a good faith effort. If you have procurements that exceed certain values, then you do have to provide a small business subcontracting plan, and that's FAR 52 219.9. If you have a contract value that is below the threshold, but it is increased through a modification and now is above the threshold, that also might trigger a subcontracting plan requirement. You might get into a situation because of the way that small business requirements are implemented where you qualify as small under various NAICS codes, but for a particular procurement, you don't qualify as small and you get the prime contract. You think of yourself as a small business, but you, in that case, are actually still required to comply with the small business subcontracting requirements because for that particular contract, you are not a small business. Next slide. And that's a point that really goes to this here, that there are exceptions for subcontracting plan requirements, but it's not a blanket exception if you're small under your primary NAICS code. It's an exception if you are a small business for purposes of that procurement. And you have to be ready to prepare a small business subcontracting plan if you have a prime contract under certain NAICS codes, whereas you might be exempt under others. You're exempt if you've got contracts that are performed entirely outside the US or personal service contracts. Otherwise, you've got to be thinking about the requirement. The government is asked for those plans. It's not self-implementing exactly. If you look at the language of 52 219.9, it says the contracting officer asks, but you should expect that you will be asked because they're supposed to ask you. Next slide. There are a couple different types of plans, and there are required reportings also now implementing this. There are individual plans that is contract specific, master plans and commercial plans. Typically that's thinking about a contractor that's selling commercial products and services, but master and commercial plans are plans that are applied organization-wide for an entity rather than just contract specific. But individual plans are the most common. They are looking at full periods of performance for a contract, usually including goals based on your subcontracting projections in your offer initially, and usually are going to be inclusive of indirect costs, although not necessarily. And when you do include indirect costs, you have to show the methodology you're using for allocating those costs. Next slide. So I mentioned that they have teeth. These plans have teeth. They have teeth. You really do need to be sure that you're complying in good faith with the requirements of your plan, which includes required reporting and cooperating with the government in studies and surveys to determine your compliance. There are certainly instances where, despite your best efforts, you wanted to subcontract with small businesses, you had planned on it, but they're just not able to deliver. That's not a failure to comply in good faith. Failure to comply in good faith is just total failure to implement the requirements as you had committed to. In those cases, there is a liquidated damages clause. You might be assessed effectively their penalties. I mean, it can't conceptually be penalties because you're not supposed to have penalties in contracts, but in reality, they are penalties and they're generally going to be enforced. The government can terminate you for default, and they can give you negative past performance reviews. Conceptually, they could suspend or debar you too, depending on how egregious it is. It can also, again, conceptually become the basis for False Claims Act actions. You say you are performing, you are awarding X% of work to small businesses and you aren't, and you knew it. That could be the basis for a False Claims Act action because the government will deem it as material to your payment request under your higher tier contract. Next slide. So good faith is always somewhat of a nebulous concept. Congress directed the SBA to give examples of what failure to make a good faith effort is. The SBA did that in a 2019 rulemaking, identifying 9 activities reflective of a failure to make a good faith effort. Generally, these are failures to submit subcontracting reports, pay small business subcontractors, have employees that actually monitor the plans, maintain records, demonstrate procedures for compliance, etc. It's worth taking a look and knowing what the SBA considers to be a good faith failure to comply and what you should generally be doing when you are administering a subcontract plan to ensure you don't get hit with these pretty significant penalties. Next slide. So mentor protege program, certainly important to be aware of. A lot of large government contractors will have some mentor protege arrangements from time to time, or maybe even more than one at a time. It used to be 2 different programs that were combined, and the All Small program and the 8A mentor protege program are now one. It creates a lot less confusion this way. A mentor protege agreement can last up to 6 years. There are limitations on the numbers of proteges and mentors. A mentor can only have 3 proteges at a time. A protege can only have 2 mentors. They might just be for different reasons, different types of procurements. Next slide. The mentor protege agreements themselves are very complicated. It is worth, if you're considering entering into one, take a look at the regulations that are cited here because they are nuanced. The agreement itself has to have a description of what the mentor will be giving the protege, what kind of assistance. The mentor is committing to provide assistance for at least 1 year in these agreements. There is a 30-day notice provision for terminations. The agreement itself and the changes to the agreement are subject to SBA approval, and they establish a single point of contact for the agreement. You have to be careful that you're following the requirements. Next slide. The plans come with an annual business plan update. The SBA evaluates. That's going to include what actual assistance the mentor gave the protege, loans or investments that the mentor is making the protege, subcontract awards, overall federal contract awards to the entity or to the mentor protege arrangement, and a narrative describing how the mentor is actually benefiting the protege. This program is not intended to be a way for large businesses to just get awards of small business set-asides. It is really intended to have a tangible benefit and a purpose for the mentor or for the protege. The protege is learning from the sophisticated, more developed business and how to participate in government contracts and how to manage its business and perform, so that after the relationship ends, it will be in a better position than it was. Next slide. If you've done it right and you have a valid agreement, then the mentor protege JV is allowed to bid on and perform set-asides that the protege qualifies for. It does not create an affiliation based on the assistance that the mentor is providing under the agreement. And if you're qualifying with all the other requirements, then you can be awarded an unlimited number of contracts within a 2-year period, beginning from the date of the award of the first contract, which includes orders under previously awarded contracts after 2 years. And if you submitted an offer before the end of that 2-year period, you're still allowed to receive new awards. This replaces a kind of arbitrary rule that was in place, 3 and 2, and no more than 3 contracts in 2 years. It really didn't make very much sense, and so it's not the rule anymore. Next slide. So the JV agreement that is the entity that is going to be doing the work, that has very nuanced requirements as well. It has to set forth the particular purpose of the entity. The small business has to be the entity managing the venture, has to own at least 51%. It has to provide that profits are distributed commensurate with the work performed, and keep in mind that the small business performs at least 40% of the JV work per the regulations. There has to be a special bank account established, an itemized list of the contributions, equipment, facilities, etc. Member responsibilities have to be stated. Both parties are ensuring performance, and there is a whole lot more setting out how to determine control and ownership. There are some exceptions where the large business still does get some element of control, but you really, again, you have to be careful when you're setting up one of these that you are complying with the requirements, because otherwise you will not be able to take advantage of the set-aside opportunities. And next slide. So having very briefly mentioned a lot of these programs, I'll talk a bit about protests. So there are plenty of protests concerning small business. Some of them are challenging the eligibility of the awardee to receive the set-aside contract. There are different rules depending on this particular program, but generally you're going to be filing, if you're filing a protest and you're eligible for protesting, you'd be filing it with the contracting officer, and it is then referred to the SBA's area office. The contracting officer and the SBA can both initiate protests as well. And when they do that, there are no timeliness requirements that would otherwise apply. I recently saw a protest, or had a protest, where the upset offeror filed with the contracting officer. The area office and the SBA dismissed it because the offeror was not next in line for award, and so wasn't an interested party, but then the SBA initiated the protest on its own. Ultimately, it went on appeal to SBA Office of Hearing and Appeals, SBA OHA, which reversed the decision before that. But you're going to get very different types of decisions depending on who in the area, which area office, and the person in charge of issuing the decision. OHA hears a lot of these types of cases. That's really all it does. And you get a little bit more of a developed body of law from them. Typical protest grounds are an entity that exceeds the size standard for a procurement, argument that an entity is violating the non-manufacture rule, or that there's some basis for affiliation that wasn't considered. Sometimes you'll have a size protest that is challenging compliance with FAR 52, 219.14, the limitations of subcontracting. That's not generally appropriate for a size protest, but you will occasionally see it anyway. You'll also see challenges that there have been misrepresentations. The entity's not actually controlled by the people it says it's control it, etc. These are fact-specific issues, and of course, like with any protest, and depends on the circumstance. And I think that is it for us. I kept it just under an hour, so hopefully it wasn't too much information. You're not all inundated, but again, each of these areas of small business requirements have a ton of depth, and it is important to be familiar with the regulations, both FAR and the SBA regs. Sometimes there are discrepancies between those two, and of course to know who to call when issues pop up. So appreciate the opportunity and hope you all have a great day.
Zach, thanks so much for presenting this information in a easy to understand format and just taking the time to be with us all live today. Again, all of our webinars are recorded. You can find this on our YouTube channel. If you are actually listening to the YouTube recording now, please leave a comment, like the video, and if you have questions about FAR Part 19, please reach out to Zach directly. Otherwise, we're happy to put you in touch with him. If you're looking for the slides, again, you can find those over on the slideshare.net site. You can log into slideshare.net with your LinkedIn credentials, and you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint there. Again, thanks everybody. Thanks, Zach, and have a great rest of your day.